If ever there was a game I would have much rather watched than played, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt would be it. Excitement that stemmed from the release of the game all the way back in 2015 quickly gave way to frustration, boredom, and exhaustion as soon as I started playing, despite enjoying certain parts of the experience quite a bit. There was a part of me that knew this going in too, you know? I've fallen off of the Western RPG hype train, thanks to the intense infatuation the genre has with mediocre combat, oft mind-numbing writing, and repetitive quest design. But I'd heard so many fantastic things about The Witcher 3, not to mention seen a combat system that seemed like it was ripped straight from Dark Souls. An open-world Dark Souls Western RPG with a supposedly great story? Count me in. What The Witcher 3 does right, it does better than any other game in its genre, hands down. But that makes the mistakes all the more painful and more difficult for me to tolerate. Note before we go any further that I did almost none of the side content outside of quest lines for major characters, and a few minor side quests at the beginning. So this isn't a review of the game as a whole, so much as a quote-unquote review of the main quest line, and the type of experiences one has within that. Also note that there will be spoilers everywhere in this. You have been warned. So we might as well start with what The Witcher does best, better than any other game in the genre: characters and events within the story. Holy crap, if this didn't exist, you'd have seen a video from me months ago apologizing for not doing a Witcher 3 video since I hated the game so much. Not only are the characters and events the highlight of the game, but they're really the only part that kept me going for the most part. Dialogue in The Witcher 3 is incredibly natural, both in how it's written and how it's acted. CD Projekt Red even did what most other Western RPGs suck at doing, and created dialogue chains that nearly always feel natural to play through. It doesn't really matter what choice I pick as Geralt, in what order. It nearly always feels like a natural conversation instead of a chain of questions in an interrogation. Characters feel real in this regard. Their dialogue gives subtle hints about their characterization and past. They don't always beat you over the head with personality traits, which leads to much more likable characters even when you don't actually like them as a person. Make of this what you will, but for me, the only major weak point was actually Ciri, who always seemed to come off as a whiny brat. I know that's sort of the point. She's a young person struggling with who she is, who she wants to be, and the weight on her shoulders, and a lust to prove herself to her elders. But once she shows up in the story, it's far too common for her to be the catalyst for events that don't go as well as they could have. She's this story's go-tanks, constantly making trouble for everyone because she just can't sit still, shut up, and trust that the people she looks up to actually know what they're doing. And she does make better decisions than the others once or twice as well. But that doesn't mean I didn't find her headstrong nature and constant need to throw wrenches in the gears kind of off-putting. Despite being an Adam Jensen type in terms of some of his personality traits, and his voice work. That's the best impression of that I can do.
Find something else to laugh at. I don't know, catch some frogs and shove straws up their asses.
Geralt is much more likable than I thought he'd be. As a main character, he wonderfully balances between a blank slate for the player's choices and a character all unto his own. I expected him to be a somewhat brooding, overly serious gruff hero, but he's so much more human than that. The same goes for all of the other characters. They all have traits, but those traits don't control all of their actions. That's a pitfall I feel most writers constantly fall into, which is refusing to have their characters make seemingly out-of-character choices. People are not robots. Everyone will make decisions that they don't feel represent them, and fall outside of the bounds of their normal actions. So it's great to see a game embrace this. Yennefer could easily have just been a cranky, sexy, dominant woman, but there are glimpses of so much more under the surface, and none of it ever steps over the line into conveniently out of character as a means to further the plot. It's a narrow tightrope to balance on, and this game does it extremely well. It's also interesting how they can make characters from previous games interesting for fans of the series, but also interesting for new players. Dandelion is of course the perfect example. If you pay attention to how the questline to find him is portrayed, it uses build-up and mystery to excite new players. Dandelion is built up for 10 hours to be this hilarious, clever, but misogynistic coward. We don't see him the entire time, but instead hear of his exploits while following his trail, the tension growing exponentially until we finally meet him. This engages players who are new to the series, but it also gives existing fans a fun and funny chain of events they can fully and completely imagine Dandelion taking part in. As far as the story is concerned, individual quests maintain this extreme level of quality. Very, very rarely was I bored with the plot events of any quest in the main storyline. Even when The Witcher delves into the depths of common Western RPG tropes, it always seems to fish out something uniquely engaging. Some of my personal favorites are any of the ones involving Dijkstra, the main questline when you first arrive in Skellige, and Through Time and Space with Avallac'h. This quest is simple, but still really breathtaking. It sees Geralt and Avallac'h teleporting through different worlds, trying to get to the elven homeworld. The visuals are amazing, and the things we learn about the threat of the White Frost kept me engaged all the way through, despite some janky direction during one specific part. The game can be pretty brave when it wants to be too. No other game outside of Final Fantasy X-2 is courageous enough to let players sit through an entire song performance for seemingly little reason. However, where X-2 feels self-indulgent in this act, Witcher 3 makes it feel natural and honest, as just a moment of world building. But wait, there's more! The game even strikes gold when related to making choices in quests mean something. Seriously, it seems like nearly every choice will lead to something different, even if just to a small degree. Small choices can lead to entirely new quests, and pretty large effects down the road. But they also create little deviations in the moment-to-moment gameplay. The amount of replayability in this game's story seems absolutely enormous, while also being very engaging and meaningful. I also like that Geralt is instead eventually positioned as the person helping the one who's to be the hero. It's refreshing to not be the chosen one for once, and instead be the one to help them in their quest. This is also proof that the characters are mostly great, because even though I didn't care much for Ciri as the player, I did feel Geralt's sadness for her. Which, yes, means I got the worst ending where she dies, I suppose. But I actually like it that way, since I'm not big on perfectly wrapped up endings in games that are otherwise pretty gray. Unfortunately, that's where my praise for this game's storyline comes to an end. Which, I mean, yeah, that does mean that the game succeeds in most of the major ways that other Western RPGs fail, but it's not perfect. The biggest problem? Pacing. Witcher 3 seems to take from the RPGs of the 80s and 90s when it comes to pacing. The amount of time you spend just spinning your wheels related to the main plot, well, why don't we just take a look-see at how much time it is? Since I captured all of my gameplay other than a handful of sittings in the beginning where I was just doing side content, we can keep track of how long each section took. So the game opens up with a short prologue, before then offering the player 3 quests to complete. Each of them requires searching for Ciri in different areas of the world. Sounds fairly simple, so how long does it take? Well, completing all 3 of these quest lines while doing nothing but going quest to quest and occasionally stopping by a storage container or blacksmith took me 45 hours. 45 hours to do the 3 quests that started the game off. And what did I accomplish in terms of my main goal during these 3 quests? Well, I learned that Ciri had indeed been in these locations, and that she'd been traveling with an elf and a magic box. That's genuinely all I learned that furthered the plot. Then, after all of that, I was able to do a quest where I actually found Ciri. The first problem with this is that I actually already knew all of this information by the end of the first quest line of these 3. So from around 13 hours in, all the way to the 45-hour mark, I didn't learn anything that moved the plot forward. Sure, I learned about the individual events that took place in these areas, and I also did a lot of things pertaining to other events and characters that were being built up for later. But for 4/5 of the game, I did almost nothing productive related to the main story. That's right, after all these quests were over and I finally found Ciri, a whopping 7.5 hours of content remained in the story. I understand it now in hindsight that the game was trying to build up relationships for the later Battle of Kaer Morhen, as well as some other later events. But I don't think that excuses the fact that it was all wrapped up in 3 singular questlines that revealed a little of worth about the main goal. Firstly, I have no way of knowing that these quests tie into later events until I get to said later events. But beyond that, it still means that the main plot stays stagnant for most of the game. There's an argument to be made that Geralt himself is still learning things he needs to know, and this is true. But I'm not Geralt. I'm the player, and the player should always be kept in mind when writing a story for a game. From my perspective as the player, it's obvious that Ciri's not going to be in any of these locations, since it offers 3 places to look in from the outset, all with scaling levels. Clearly, I need to go to all of them before I'll find her. With that in mind, none of the events feel like they're for my sake, and instead feel like they're arbitrary roadblocks. We've all seen that RPG trope about how obnoxious their quest chains can be, and how ridiculously pointless quests can seem in the grand scheme of things. Hero, you need to find the magical amulet to save the world, but only the village elder has seen it. Unfortunately, he's been taken by goblins, and these goblins live on Fire Volcano, so you'll need to find firewalking boots to get there. Those boots can only be crafted from orichalcum, which can only be mined from the mine in Average Town, but Average Town has been captured by Emperor Evil and his men. To get in without being sliced up, you'll need blah blah blah. Don't believe that this is how The Witcher does things? Let's test it out on the first of these 3 questlines. So to find Ciri and Velen, I need to talk to the Baron. To get the info from him, I need to save his wife and daughter. To do that, I need to investigate the area where they had a fight. In doing so, I'll find an amulet that could help us find his family. So now I need to go ask a local peddler for help. To get said help, I need to fight off some people harassing him, then find his goat. I'm informed that the Baron is responsible for his unborn child's death. But before I can confront him about it, I need to save the Baron's horses from a fire. Then I need to beat him up to calm him down, so that he'll show me where he hastily buried his late child. However, the child is transformed into a monster. Now I need to escort the Baron with his child-turned-monster toward the manor for a proper burial, in order to turn him into a sort of spirit that can help. The child's ghost will then lead me to the Baron's daughter. Oh, but we're not done yet. I also need to find his wife. To find his wife, I need to meet with the local witch. To find the witch, I need to ask around and follow the trail. Once I find her, I need to explore a dungeon to locate information about Ciri. Exploring the dungeon nets me knowledge that Ciri was here, with an elf, and that they were looking for a magic box, as well as a book that tells me about the crones in a nearby bog who might know where Ciri is now. To meet with the crones and find Ciri and the Baron's wife, I need to talk to the children mysteriously living in the bog. But the lady that's taking care of them doesn't want them talking to me. To get information from them, I need to play hide and seek with them and win. When I do, they tell me where to find another boy named Johnny, who can help me meet the crones. So then I have to find Johnny. When I get to Johnny, though, he can't speak. To get him to speak, I need to find a bottle with his voice in it. To do that, I need to get it from a harpy's nest. Once I've talked to Johnny, the lady taking care of the orphans will allow me to talk to the crones. They give me a dagger as a sign of their temporary allegiance and tell me to go talk to the head of a local village called Downwarren and help him with something he's having trouble with. When I get there, he tells me about an ancient tree that has a curse on it that needs lifting. So then I go to the tree. When I get to the tree, I need to cure the curse. To cure the curse, I need 3 specific items. So then I have to hunt for these items in the local area. Once I've done all that, the spirit is free. When I go back to the crones, I then at least get a bit of information from them about Ciri's whereabouts. But I've also learned that the lady taking care of the orphans is the Baron's wife. So when I go back to the Baron, I can finally get his information about Ciri. He tells me that he found Ciri staying with a family nearby. They raced horses, killed a basilisk, and then Ciri had to leave because the use of her magic will attract the Wild Hunt. So what of use did we actually learn here? Well, it's not useful to learn that she was staying with a family nearby. It's not useful to learn that they raced horses. It's not really useful to learn that they killed a basilisk, which means that she had to leave. So essentially the only thing I really learned is that Ciri was here with an elf to get a magic box. That's it. Now I'm aware that all of this just sounds like a normal string of quests. What's wrong with it exactly? The problem is in how little of it related to the actual goal at hand. The vast majority of the tasks set out here do nothing but impede progress. I need to do this, but in order to do it, I need to first do this, and this, and this, and this, with none of these tasks relating to the main goal. And again, this goes on for 45 hours of the 53-ish hour playthrough. This entire Valen questline took me around 13 hours by itself. At least by the end of it, like I said, I learned that Ciri had indeed been here, was traveling with an elf, and had a magical box in her possession. So what about the next quest in Novigrad? That took another 10 hours, and what did I learn there? That Ciri had been in Novigrad, she had a magical box in her possession, and had been traveling with an elf. So, nothing. Yes, there's more to it, but in terms of accomplishing something, I have accomplished nothing. I'm not actually finding Ciri at this point, I'm doing chores. Quests often lead to chains of other quests, meaning they can feel way too long and give the impression that the story is content to meander, wasting the player's time. Most of the time, entire 2 to 4 hour play sessions were nothing but 1, maybe 2 quests that just chained endless objectives together. I found it particularly annoying that after all the roadblocks already, I'm then expected to grind for coin to get into Skellige. 1,000 gold isn't a small amount at that point, unless you're regularly stopping by shops to sell garbage, which is kind of tedious. It's not exactly simple until you've increased your carrying capacity by a rather large amount, something I was saving up to do until I had to spend it going to Skellige. Luckily, I had enough junk saved up in my stash that I could do both, but still. I'll state this one more time because it's that important. Whether Geralt is learning things he finds useful or not doesn't change the meta understanding that I, as the player, has, which is that Ciri will not be any of the first 3 locations. That changes player perception of events whether CD Projekt Red likes it or not. Pacing your story for the player is no different than designing good game feel, so that attacks feel more useful and impactful. Great sound effects and particle effects don't actually change the mechanics themselves, but as a player, it still feels better. That's important. I've seen some people argue that I'm doing the story a disservice by not playing the side quests along the way, that doing so will somehow fix these issues because you're meant to play the side quests in between story missions. But this makes no sense. Firstly, side quests are optional for a reason. If I needed to play them to get good pacing, they should have been main quests. Secondly, all this really does is make the pacing worse. Not only does it mean I'm spending more time on tasks that don't further my main goal, but it doesn't even align with the urgency Geralt exhibits in relation to finding Ciri. This is a timed task of great importance, because the hunt could catch up with Ciri at any moment, so it makes no sense that Geralt should therefore be spending days hunting monsters and stuff for random peasant villages. I think a good solution would have simply been to double up on long-term goals a bit. Far be it from me to use Kingdom Hearts as a beacon for good storytelling, but Kingdom Hearts 1 actually does this well. Sure, my goal is to find Mickey, Kairi, and Riku, but my goal is also to seal the keyholes to save each world. As a person, Sora is looking for his friends, but as the only one who can seal the keyholes, he needs to help the people in the worlds he goes to so that darkness doesn't overtake everything. These goals perfectly align with the player's goals to explore and learn more about what's happening. So even though I don't find his friends for 10 hours, and I'm not expecting to find his friends all this time, I'm still accomplishing a bigger goal set out for me that correlates directly with Sora's interest, which is saving these worlds from the darkness that's corrupting them. If the worlds fall to darkness, it doesn't matter if he finds his friends or not. Then, the smaller goals in each individual world supplement that further, making it feel like I'm always moving forward while still learning and expanding my understanding of the world at large. The Witcher could have done the same thing by including more events related to the Wild Hunt. Not only would it build this villainous entity up more, but it would also give the player something to actually accomplish related to the main goals along the way. You don't necessarily have to remove any of the quests that are already there. Just tie the Wild Hunt into a few of them so that I'm still making progress on something along the way. It's funny, actually, because some parts of the game that should be longer and more comprehensive are really short for some reason. The Isle of Mists is a good example. It's built up like a big deal, because I'm effectively going to an island that doesn't seem to exist in the same plane of reality as the rest of the world. Who knows if I can get back? What's more, it's strongly suggested that this is where I'll finally find Ciri. It is indeed where you find Ciri, by the way, so it's kind of important, you would think. Yet despite being pretty different in tone and aesthetics from the rest of the world, and treating itself like a huge undertaking that's not to be taken lightly, this quest lasts less time than the one that directly preceded it, which is just about running around to talk to people you've helped to see if they'll help you defend Ciri. The Isle of Mist quest seems like it's going to be a big deal. We've had 45 hours leading up to this, but it's over in 10 minutes, and there's not really any fanfare. The only other thing I really wanted to touch on related to the story was its inclusion of nudity. While I'm not really big on this personally, it doesn't really bother me as long as it's not obnoxious. Overall, it only bugged me in one respect. I personally dislike that a lot of the sex seems to be a reward for helping female characters out. It doesn't matter to me that each of the women I had this option with also seemed to be previously intimate with Geralt. It still felt like it was a gameplay reward for the player first, and an important event in Geralt's life second, especially because of all the random flirting that interjects itself at random times. It's kind of distracting, and one of the only things about the dialogue that I didn't enjoy. My point is that, for me, it just kind of felt gross that these incredibly deep and independent characters were essentially reduced to sexy gameplay rewards for the player. Even if, again, that's not how it is for Geralt, that's still how it translates to the player. Help a girl, get her in bed. At least the scenes were optional. If we back up for a second, you might remember me saying that I wish I could have just watched The Witcher instead of playing it. Obviously, the problems outlined above shouldn't affect that too much, right? And yeah, the severe story pacing issues don't necessarily affect the gameplay to the degree that I don't want to play it. Unfortunately, the gameplay itself comes with a whole host of its own problems that create that. Firstly, would you believe me if I told you that the quest design is also just as poorly paced much of the time? Sometimes it can be great, but other times... Take this quest related to the Crones as an example. It consisted of me following red stuff, talking to people, moving a few dozen yards, more talking, moving back outside, more talking, following red stuff, more talking, moving to an area a bit away and killing some drowners and a water hag, talking, following a character briefly, climbing up a hill to fight some harpies, talking again, following the character again, killing more drowners along the way, more talking, going to a new location, more talking, running errands to 3 other unremarkable locations, killing more drowners and another water hag, returning, talking to a character, going outside to talk to another character, returning to the first area to talk more, then a brief and ultimately scripted flashback, before yet more talking. The story stuff was engaging, but not only was the gameplay not that interesting or unique, but if you include every bit where I'm in control of Geralt's movement just to be generous, it also only consisted of about 15 minutes of the hour-long quest, and this was a main quest. It wasn't like it was frustrating or mind-numbing, but it wasn't really engaging either, since very little of it was gameplay, and what was there had no depth or variety to it. A lot of quests seem to be this way. Long, lots of story, but otherwise pretty empty. They're devoid of gameplay a lot of the time. The story stuff is fun, but I personally don't really play games to be forced to sit through endless cutscenes, even if they're well made. I want to play the game I bought too. Well, Elder Scrolls and Final Fantasy XV may have much more boring writing a lot of the time. At least both the writing, the quest scripting, and the quests themselves are brief. I spend 3 minutes talking to a guy to get some backstory, then I'm on my own to go spend 15 minutes plus questing before then turning the quest in. The quest with Kira Metz just before this was much better. 10 minutes of scenes, then an entire dungeon I'm free to explore, complete with puzzles, story elements, secrets, traps, and different types of enemies. Then a climactic end sequence with a unique gameplay shift where I must stay in bubbles and protect someone along the way, and then a boss at the end. An uninteresting boss that's easy to break, but a boss nonetheless. You could make an argument for the game doing this intentionally with the main quest so that you'll supplement it with the side quests, since from the few I did early on they seem to be a lot more gameplay focused. But again, you shouldn't have to go to optional content to get a properly paced experience. I don't think I would have near as much of an issue with this if it wasn't so constant throughout the main quest. I'm not joking when I say that you can often go more than an hour doing nothing but moving between people to talk to and then having conversations. I think this would have been more acceptable if, when the combat did break out, it wasn't so often just against basic drowners or humans. Heck, nearly every single fight in the main quest is with something humanoid, and they're always extremely easy to exploit, presenting no mechanical challenge. The AI is super easy to break with these types of enemies, leading to consistent attacks coming your way and consistent openings. Combat itself is okay, but easily broken, bullet spongy, and kind of janky. Many animations feel mushy, for lack of a better descriptor, making Geralt come off as unresponsive. Many enemies can be tricked into complete predictability. Sometimes the buttons don't seem to respawn. Kinesthetics aren't great, with attacks gliding across enemies in many instances. There's no meaningful impact being felt. Hitboxes and animations are a little off at times. The locked-on camera can sometimes be set at awkward angles. Lock-on itself often just doesn't work. Honestly, it's about what you would expect from a Western RPG, though that doesn't make it any more acceptable. Though Witcher does try to bring a few new ideas to the table. Adrenaline is a cool idea, though it doesn't feel like it has any impact. It'd be nice if sound effects for attacks maybe got more fierce, the font size numbers got bigger, and maybe your weapon started to glow red as the adrenaline meter grew. As it stands, though I do know the system functions and definitely helps in fights, it doesn't feel like it helps. This is the sort of little thing that could add up to fantastic combat if done well, or dreadful combat when done poorly. And in this case, there are just a ton of little things that end up with a combat system that feels floaty, mushy, and imprecise. Using Ciri actually feels a lot better. Not great, but better. She seems to stagger enemies a lot quicker, her attacks seem more swift, and her dodges are high speed. While many of your combat options seem ineffective, there are still a few parts of your arsenal that feel far too effective, allowing players to rely almost solely on them. Though mushy, the dodge roll gives you insane invincibility frames. Geralt regularly refuses to stagger when getting hit due to some sort of hyper armor being activated on many of his actions, and the shield spell can allow you to tank 100% of the damage you'd otherwise take for one or more hits. This means combat can super easily turn into nothing but casting Ken and mashing light attack in between basic dodges. Once you get hit, back off. Most likely your stamina will be nearly regenerated and you can cast Ken again. The problem isn't that this is possible necessarily, it's that there's no mechanical punishment for it. Very, very rarely is this not the optimal choice in relation to effort versus payoff. It's a dominant strategy through and through. It doesn't matter what the other options you have at that point are, if this one usurps them all in terms of how cost-effective it is. The game has several other interesting spells and systems to offer, but nearly all of them are only really used to supplement this tactic, with no additional strategy required. Crafting and alchemy feel deep, but they're too vast. Firstly, it makes finding materials meaningless and goals difficult to strive for, since there's no effective way I could find to push toward specific materials I needed. You just play until you run across them. It feels like Fallout 4, where you just sort of pick up all the things and hope you eventually have what you need. At least it's not as tedious, because a lot of the ingredients, including all of the alchemy stuff, weighs nothing. Even if the game was challenging, like say if you turned up the difficulty, I don't see what makes a lot of the alchemy that interesting. I've heard people praise the system and its potential for pre-battle preparation. But what about it is engaging? Nearly all of the oils are just generic damage buffs. That's not a strategic choice. It's a positive decision to use oils if you have them, no matter what. Bombs are more interesting, but still mostly amount to poison, frost, or fire effects on top of basic damage. Potions are a bit more interesting in effect too, as are decoctions. But again, most of them are no-brainers if you've got access to the ones that'd be useful in a certain situation. It effectively means if you have a specific potion that could help you and you're having trouble, there's no reason not to use it. 25% damage boost to werewolves will only help me against werewolves, so if I have it, I should always use it against werewolves and never use it against anything else. It's that simple, that's not strategy. On top of that, a lot of the more interesting ones are difficult to get access to in the first place, because of the difficulty in finding specific materials needed to make them. Some would argue that the strategy is in using these things sparingly, because you might not always have the alcohol est you need to refill them. But regardless of what you need to refill, it will only consume a single alcohol est to fill it. And don't get me wrong, I like the alcohol est as a universal refill tool, so that decoctions are much easier to keep stocked up, making them more worth using. But a side effect of this is that it undermines the entire system. There's not much of a risk to spam potions because they're so easy to refill. The only thing you need to strategize around is toxicity, but unless you know to invest directly into abilities related to toxicity, that's more of just a general limiter instead of something you cleverly work around. It might be a bit better on the hardest difficulty, but that's not saying much. I firmly believe all difficulties should incentivize using all available mechanics. Easier difficulties should just allow players to make more mistakes along the way. When I can pick normal and then proceed to ignore all alternative weapon types, all spells but the shield, all bombs, all potions and decoctions other than the basic healing and damage buff ones, there's a problem. Honestly, the biggest thing that left me unwilling to use so many of the other potions, bombs, etc. was that I was too lazy to equip them. While playing on normal, I never felt the need to use any of them that weren't for healing or the Thunderbolt potion that boosts general attack damage. I mean, doesn't this just look riveting? Once again, as with many action-oriented RPGs, the biggest problem comes down to the fact that stats and levels are what almost exclusively dictates difficulty. In an action game. Man, I hate it when games do this. As I've said before on this channel, the more direct a player's control over the character is, the more dangerous it is to have complex stats dictating whether your actions are successful or not. It always has felt, and always will feel awful in Morrowind when you're standing directly in front of an enemy wailing away, and yet you're consistently missing because you're statistically not accurate enough to hit anything. But this goes far beyond easy-to-see problems like that. The more common and more dangerous issue is when general difficulty balance is poorly structured around such stats. I'm of the mindset that very, very few combat encounters in action games should be impossible at any point, as long as the player is skilled enough to beat it. The Witcher 3 seems to kind of agree and tries to do that, but because of the mushy controls and the equipment degradation system and the statistical disadvantage you can be at, it doesn't exactly work. So what ends up happening if you try anything too far above your level is that you tend to get one-shot, all while the game expects you to hit the enemy potentially thousands of times before they'll die. Better have a half dozen brand new swords on hand. Now the game does have an option for bringing the level of weaker enemies up to your own, and that's fine, but it doesn't weaken stronger enemies, so many encounters stay impossible until you level up. Sure, I totally understand that enemies that are intended to be tough should actually be tough, but turning them into a war of attrition doesn't feel like the right answer, especially since leveling up can make them a joke. So I'm supposed to bow to the lore and agree that so-and-so dragon enemy is way more powerful than a witcher, and should be insanely difficult. But I'm then also supposed to ignore the fact that a master witcher like Geralt can somehow absorb the ether or something to become even stronger than said dragon later? So leveling works in tandem with the story when Geralt is weaker than the enemy, but are an isolated gameplay mechanic that's there just for player progression when Geralt gets stronger than a monster he has no right being stronger than. See how that line of logic doesn't make any sense? Games like Dark Souls still rely on stats for balance, as do most games, though to often extremely simple degrees. But the difference is that Dark Souls allows players to independently supplement their stats at low levels. When the enemy you're fighting in The Witcher has thousands of HP, using an oil that raises your damage against them by 25% isn't going to help if you were only doing 30 damage to begin with. But in Dark Souls, upgrading your weapon can supplement your damage output to such a degree that you're doing normal damage for whatever area of the game you choose to explore, despite potentially being level 1. In Witcher, you won't likely find a super strong weapon until you've leveled up, and even if you couldn't wield it until your level was high enough. This means that The Witcher essentially offers you an ultimatum. Beat your head against the wall in the hopes that you can kill this enemy without getting hit once, or go somewhere else. Despite being an open world, this feels really restrictive. Dark Souls likewise allows you to use different systems and strategies to your advantage, to even beat it at level 1. I know, another comparison to Dark Souls, but it's a great example. Another great example would be Kingdom Hearts 2. If you play on critical mode, you have the option to enable an ability that makes it so that Sora doesn't gain any experience. So you can do level 1 runs of KH2. Stats in Kingdom Hearts are much simpler than even Dark Souls. Most stats never even break triple digits. That helps simplify and counterbalance for starters, but more importantly, many of your combat abilities are gained through means other than leveling Sora up. Summons and drive forms are gained through exploration and story events. Keyblades are too, as are other forms of equipment and even magic. Many combat abilities like combo pluses, quick run, dodge roll, etc. are gained from leveling drive forms. All of this still means that the player grows a powerful arsenal of options without the need to level a single time. Then, skill with these abilities is what dictates success or failure. Enemies are rarely too spongy to handle even at level 1. The Witcher almost gets this right. You can upgrade equipment, upgrade abilities, and create potions, bombs, etc. all without leveling up. So theoretically, anything is possible to complete even at level 1. But again, because stats scale so drastically, it's not a fair fight if the enemy is too high of a level. It's not engaging because none of these options adequately supplement the weakness you have from being a lower level. What this meant for my playthrough is that when I was overleveled, I could only find a challenge by turning the lower level scaling on. When I was the correct level, enemies still didn't present much of a challenge. When enemies were a few levels above me, they were decently engaging, but the mushy controls and the poor AI got in the way of that usually. And when they were way above me, I stood absolutely no chance and had no reason to waste my time. This wouldn't be a huge deal either if most of the side content wasn't accessible right away and sprawled across the map. A large reason why I barely did any of the side content is because within just a few hours, my quest list was full of quests that were between levels 15 and 30, and I was level 3 or whatever. This clogged up my quest inventory, making finding the right quest difficult, but it also was the game outright telling me to not waste my time on this stuff until later. But beyond that, it wasn't uncommon for me to run across random mobs in the world that were light years ahead of me in terms of levels, sometimes even on main roads that quests would send me down. As I touched on before, this inherently restricts the player's ability to explore the open world. At that point, why is it an open world if 90% of the places I go push back so hard that I can't progress? There were a handful of interesting fights around my level, but they never provided a real challenge. This was probably the closest to a success, and it was one of the last fights in the game. More interesting than the final boss, by the way. Even though he was still easy to outplay and only had 2 basic ranged attacks and an ice element summoning spell, it was cool that I had to use his attacks against him. The goal, if you don't want to go insane, is to get him to shoot his own summoned ally, which is a fun idea. Moving on, maps in settlements could use an improvement to usability. Not only do they not convey where pathways into or under buildings and such are to the degree that they should, but things like shops are generic icons with generic descriptions, failing to tell the player what type of shop you're even looking at. Plus, I couldn't find a way to have the GPS trail lead me to custom markers, meaning I had to wander complex places like Novigrad essentially blind if I wanted to go somewhere that doesn't have a quest marker. And I also had an issue with the only Novigrad blacksmith that I could find, where I found stuff to create some Witcher gear, found the blacksmith who could make it, but first I had to do a quest for him. This ended up being far too high of a level quest, and I couldn't do it for at least 24 hours. Meaning I was forced to fast travel elsewhere whenever I wanted to use a blacksmith for most of the game, because this one was waiting for me somewhere else and couldn't be used as a smith or a shop. It's a small thing, sure, but it's still frustrating to me that within 5 hours I'd already broken the only blacksmith in the biggest hub in the game. Oh, and one more thing. I hate the horse racing. I know that's not a revelation, since everyone hates the horse racing. Its issue is simple. Opponents are as fast as your horse when sprinting, but your horse's stamina is rarely enough to do the whole course, so races always go in one of 3 ways. Either you stay ahead the whole time because your horse has enough stamina to sprint the whole way, your horse doesn't have enough stamina so you're forced to slow down, which allows the opponent past and you never catch them. Stamina usually runs out 9/10 of the way through the race, by the way. Or, when you're forced to slow down to regain stamina, you exploit the dumb opponent AI and block their path until you can start sprinting again. Yeah, the game really didn't need this as a way to add variety. It should have been removed from most of the 5 or 6 instances where it exists in the main story. Oh, also, before I forget, Gwent is a thing. It seems interesting, but I suck at it. And I'm also not a huge fan of digital card games where my opponent can just have objectively superior cards that make it impossible for me to win. Moving on. So all that's really left to talk about from here is the presentation, and what else did you expect? This game is beautiful. It runs pretty well overall, though since I'm playing on a PS4 Pro, they updated it to run at a higher resolution right after I bought the game. Naturally, they didn't give me an option to turn this off. So what could have been a solid 30 frames per second at 1080p all the way through, ended up being a somewhat inconsistent 30 frames per second at 1800p or some junk, which was then downscaled to match my 1080p display. Yay, super sampling that I didn't notice. Whatever, the game is great looking regardless. Art direction is strong and really consistent despite also being really diverse. Monsters and non-humans are generally really unique within the genre, with my favorite being the godlings. Lighting in the game is also pretty good, but can sometimes move into the realm of sublime. Character models are never unintentionally ugly, and because of the great procedural animation system for most cutscenes, they always animate in ways that are far more natural than the competition in the genre. Sound design is equally as quality, with crisp, meaty sounds that do strengthen some of the weaker aspects to combat as much as they ever could. Music in the game is often not really to my liking, outside of a few songs that I greatly enjoy. However, it is all masterful in composition and recording quality. It's great music, I just don't care for a decent chunk of it personally. The UI is a bit slow at times, but otherwise more than serviceable. My only real issue deals with the fact that it's clearly designed for the PC first, since it uses the multiple-sized icon setup for items in your inventory. This can make navigating to the item you want a bit difficult at times on a controller, not to mention it's often difficult to tell the difference between items until you've highlighted them. But it works otherwise, so I don't want to complain too much. I did have a few issues along the way, some funny, some a bit off-putting. Early on, I had a problem with audio not playing, which happened once more later, I believe.
What did you need the children for?
There was also a point where Geralt must not have realized there was a boat at the dock and decided to dolphin dive headfirst into it. Then there was this strange police siren glitch that seemed to happen fairly consistently when I was wearing this specific gear, especially in Novigrad. Geralt must have also taught Roach a few new tricks in between quests, leading to this amazing stunt. Less laugh-inducing would be this issue during the last phase of the final boss, which almost got me killed. Never had any other major camera issues, so this one took me by surprise. And finally, I wasn't scared of the water in this game to any real degree. Yes, I'm terrified of big bodies of water even in games, but since 90% of the inhabitants of this world on land and off seem to be drowners, I grew pretty comfortable with the water here. Until seeing a random giant whale tail sticking out of the water. It didn't move, so I figured it was probably some sort of skeleton or something that was there for me to explore. So after the quest, I decided to check it out. And as I got close, yeah, I noped the heck out of there right quick. I saw a few more of them during my time with the game, and I think the issue is that they spawn unanimated until you get within a certain distance. Problem is, they usually spawn in mid-breaching animation, and they're so big that it's difficult to not notice that there's a giant whale frozen in time that just spawned nearby. So what's my conclusion on The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt? It's kind of hard to say to a certain degree. It's a game that I greatly respect for its attention to detail, and the relative polish it has when compared to the rest of the genre. As far as I can tell, CD Projekt continues to improve exponentially with each game in the series, but in the end, it still falls prey to many issues that have plagued the genre for a long time now. Parts of it I enjoyed, and other parts I really didn't. It was a real chore most of the time to convince myself to play it, and now that this review is over, it's definitely being deleted from my console to make room for other things. I will no doubt go back and mess around with it from time to time, but it's not really a game I want to play all the way through again. I'd much rather just watch it in movie form, where I think it'd excel much better. And on that note, I think I'll end with some footage of Geralt dancing on a table during a feast. Tell me what you think about the game, whether you agree or disagree with my assessment, and I'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in another one, here's the last one that I uploaded. You can also follow me on Twitter or subscribe by hitting the subscribe button.